Mists of Tirna Scithe is a returning dungeon for Season 1 of The War Within. The dungeon starts with a 30-minute timer, so as long as you complete the dungeon within that time frame, you'll upgrade your key. At the start of the dungeon, you'll find some strange routes that can be opened by either a herbalist, a druid, night elf, tauren, or high mountain tauren. Opening this shortcut will allow for more optimal pathing. Tirna villagers will cast Bewildering Pollen, a frontal cone attack aimed at the tank that all players must dodge. If struck, you'll suffer massive damage and be disoriented for 4 seconds. Villagers will also target a random DPS and channel Overgrowth on them, dealing huge ticking damage and then stunning the player for 6 seconds. If targeted, make sure to use a defensive and get into melee so that the Overgrowth gets cleaved down. You can also use abilities that drop combat to stop the cast, like Vanish or Feign Death. Thrust Spike Claws will leap to a random range player with Bloodletting, slashing all players within 4 yards of the location and bleeding them for 8 seconds. Multiple stacks can overlap here, so use a defensive. Upon death, they will also cast a Dying Breath, causing everything struck to take 20% increased damage for 20 seconds, so tanks should make sure to position enemies inside these swirlies while your group stays out. Drustvar Harvesters will spam cast Spirit Bolts on random players. You'll want to dump spare interrupts into this ability as it does start to hurt quite a bit, but you must save a kick for their Harvest Essence channel. This deals strong AoE ticking damage to the group that heals the Harvester for 100% of the damage dealt. This will likely wipe you if you let the Harvester channel. Drust Soul Cleavers will cast Soul Split on the tank, dealing upfront shadow damage and leaving a debuff that increases the tank's damage taken by 20% for 8 seconds. Healers must dispel this debuff to save your tank from certain death. They also buff themselves with Hand of Throws, increasing their attack speed by 30% and leeching health back to them from their attacks for 8 seconds. You should crowd control and kite them while this buff is active. Before we enter the boss room, you'll find a room on your left locked behind some more strange routes that we found earlier. The same types of players can open this wall. In this room, there are mushrooms scattered everywhere that will give you a buff for 10 minutes. Savory stat shrooms will give you 10% main stat and are generally the only shroom to be taking. Tasty tough shrooms, however, will increase your stamina by 10% for 10 minutes if you do decide to take them. You'll also find Drust Bow Breakers before the first boss. Upon reaching 50% health, they'll channel Furious Thrashing, dealing high AoE ticking damage to your whole group. Make sure to use a defensive for this, and when facing 2 of them later, do not let them hit 50% at the same time. They will also periodically cast Bramble Burst, spawning brambles at every player's location that players must immediately move out from. These brambles deal heavy ticking damage and slow anybody inside. After taking out the last 2 bow breakers, we can now engage the first boss, Ingra Maloch. This is a 2-target fight where you'll want to focus Droman whenever he is active. This is because Ingra will put up a Death Shroud, dealing group-wide ticking damage every second, but more importantly, reducing Ingra's damage taken massively. The only way that we can remove this shield is by bringing Droman to 20% health. This will break Droman's mind control, and then he will channel Droman's wrath on Ingra, causing Ingra to be stunned and take 200% increased damage for 15 seconds. Here is where you should pop your main cooldowns. After the channel, Ingra will break free from the stun and become active again, and for a short time he will take normal damage, so if he's low you can still finish him off. Outside of this main mechanic, Ingra will spam cast Spirit Bolt on random players, so players should kick this ability when they can. He will also occasionally cast Repulsive Visage, fearing the whole group away from him, so make sure you're positioned well for this. Droman will cast the same frontal we saw earlier in Bewildering Pollen that all players need to dodge, and you'll also need to dodge the swirlies sent out from Droman's Tears of the Forest cast. These swirlies will then also leave pools that your team needs to avoid. After defeating Ingra Maloch, we can now progress to the maze. Just before, there is a seed on your left that players can interact with to activate a respawn point. You'll also find 2 Mistveil defenders at the start of the maze. They will target a random player and cast Expel at them, charging to them and dealing heavy physical damage as well as knocking them back. Use the defensive if you're low here and try to stay near melee to keep uptime. They will also cast Mist Ward, dropping a large puddle of mist under them that deals ticking damage to anybody stood inside it. Tanks should make sure to kite the mobs out of the ward as soon as it's dropped to avoid taking damage, but the ward also reduces enemies' damage taken by 30%. Now it's time to explain the maze. Each room will have pillars dotted around that when stood next to will show a symbol above with different features. The idea here is to find the pillar that's the odd one out in the room, and there are 3 unique features to look out for. The symbol can be a leaf or flower, so if there's only one flower then you know to walk through the door behind that pillar. The symbol can also be filled in colour or clear, and finally the symbol can have a circle around it. Once you've established which symbol is unique in the room, simply run through the door behind it to enter the next room. If you get it wrong, then you'll be teleported back to the start of the maze. As a quick tip, if you're able to, you can actually mark Mistcaller as the RP starts for the maze, and she will go through the correct gates so you can follow the first 2 for free. Throughout the maze, there are multiple different mobs. Mistveil Guardians are lieutenant mobs that will buff their allies with Protector of the Mists, increasing their damage done by 3% per stack. They will also cast Anima Slash on the tank, a massive tank buster that deals upfront nature damage and leaves a 4-second nature dot that can stack. Tanks must be prepared for these slashes. Mistveil Shapers will cast Bramblethorn Coat. You must interrupt this ability as a successful cast will shield an ally for 8 seconds, that upon expiration will entangle your whole party, rooting everyone and dealing high ticking damage that will likely end in a wipe. Mistveil Tenders must also be kicked on their Nourish the Forest cast. If successful, this will apply a healing over time effect to all nearby mobs that will slow down your ki tremendously. Mistveil Stalkers will cast Mistveil Bite at a random party member, dealing high upfront physical damage and leaving a strong bleed for 12 seconds. If you are targeted by this, make sure to use a defensive. Mistveil Stingers will leap to a random player and apply an Anima Injection debuff to them. This deals ticking damage over 6 seconds and upon expiration will trigger an Anima Detonation that will likely one-shot the player, so healers just simply need to dispel this debuff. Finally, during the maze, you'll meet one of 3 mini-bosses. The Mistveil Matriarch will cast a Frontal Radiant Breath that you must dodge. She'll also drop a pool of radiance, healing everything inside the pool, so tanks should make sure to pull the dragon out of it. Tanks will also have to deal with her Shred Armor Tank Buster that deals huge upfront physical damage and increases the tank's damage taken by 20% for 20 seconds. Be careful not to get one-shot while this debuff is active. The Mistveil Night Blossom will cast Poisonous Discharge, spawning 3 swirlies at players' locations that need to be dodged. It will also cast Hydra Bite on the tank, dealing upfront nature damage and leaving a 15-second poison dot that can be dispelled by certain classes. And finally, the Mistveil Gorge Gullet will Crushing Leap to a player's location. Everybody must sidestep this swirly and then also dodge the Lethal Frontal in Tongue Lashing. Now we've faced every mob in the maze, once you reach the end you'll now be able to take on Mistcaller. At 70, 40 and 10% health she will cast Guessing Game. This mechanic spawns 4 adds and behaves the same as the maze we just completed. You'll need to figure out which ad is the odd one out and kill it to return to phase 1 where Mistcaller is active again. If you kill the wrong ad, the whole party will suffer big damage from penalizing Burst. During the whole fight, you'll need to keep an eye out for Dodgeball. Mistcaller will aim these balls at players' locations, so sidestep the arrows to avoid being hit and likely one-shot. She will also spawn an Illusionary Vulpin at a player's location. Once spawned, this Vulpin will fixate a random player, charging towards them, and upon making contact with any player, the Vulpin will Freezing Burst, dealing big AoE damage around it and stunning anybody struck in the ice. If you're fixated, you need to kite the Vulpin away from the group, but note that you can also crowd control it with abilities like Freezing Trap, making this mechanic much more trivial. Finally, tanks will need to pay close attention to the boss's Patty Cake cast. Tanks need to kick this, otherwise they'll take massive damage and become disoriented for 4 seconds, meaning Mistcaller will attack another party member and likely kill them before the tank can taunt back. Once Mistcaller has been defeated, you'll jump off the edge into the pool beneath. Here is another seed to set your respawn point, so players that can interact should do so. Now we'll face many different beetles. Spinemaw Acid Gullets will target a player with Volatile Acid, dealing ticking damage to the player and everyone stood within 5 yards for 8 seconds. You may want to use a defensive for this cast, especially when the Spinemaw Staghorns they're usually found with cast Acid Nova. This releases a big pulse of nature damage to the whole party, but also increases the nature damage taken by 12% for 12 seconds, and this debuff can stack. Staghorns also have 2 very important casts that must be kicked. Stimulate Resistance is the first kick, otherwise the Staghorn will shield all nearby Gorms with a huge Absorb shield. After this cast, the Staghorn will also cast Stimulate Regeneration. Kick this ASAP or it will heal all nearby Gorms over the 8-second channel. Spinemaw Gorges will also be found here, and they will launch acid globules at the ground. Simply sidestep these swirlies. These beetles will be surrounded by Spinemaw Lava that do nothing but melee the tank, and they also have significantly lower health as they're not elites. The final mob we'll fight in this area is the Spinemaw Reavers. They will leap to a random player and inject them with a debilitating poison debuff, inflicting damage every 2 seconds for 10 seconds and slowing the player. Dispel this debuff if you can. And now we're ready to take on the last boss, Tred'ova. Periodically, the boss will cast Acid Expulsion, spawning a swirly at each player's location that you need to dodge. These swirlies are unique though, because they will remember your movement to dodge them. So the next time Acid Expulsion is cast, it will fire another swirly that copied your movement pattern on the previous expulsion. Outside of this, the boss will target the tank with Mind Link, joining all players in the group to the tank and dealing damage until the tether is snapped by running 40 yards from the tank. Tred'ova will also target a player with Marked for Prey. This will spawn 4 Gormling Lavas that will fixate the targeted player. Kite and CC these lava while your group nukes them down before the fixated player gets overwhelmed by them. Players will also need to run away from the boss when it casts Coalescing Poison. This ability will pull all players to its center and then explode after 5 seconds, so make sure to run against the pool to avoid being one-shot. Finally, Tred'ova will begin to channel Consumption. gaining a massive absorb shield that needs to be burned through by the DPS before you can kick the cast. During this time, you'll need to avoid all of the swirlies on the ground while you suffer heavy ticking damage that your healer will need to out-heal. Now is also a great time to use defensives. But that's it for this boss, and that wraps up Mists of Tirna Scithe for Mythic Plus in Season 1. If you're interested in my nameplates, they are from my free Playter profile, which can be found inside my Discord. The link will be in the description, and if this guide did help you or a friend out, then please feel free to drop a like down below and subscribe to your boy. And until next time, I'll catch you guys later.